Welcome to an event with the Democracy and Debate theme semester. The title of our conversation is Lift Every Voice, U.S. Anthems in History and Performance. My name is Naomi Andre, and I'm joined by two colleagues who are specialists in thinking about singing and performance, and particularly around national anthems in the United States. And they're also my friends, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation at this really tough time where we have been sheltered in place with the coronavirus pandemic since Memorial Day, which should open up summer and all these beautiful feelings. We've had a bunch of protests after the murder of George Floyd, but also Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and also the list goes on, as you know. So as we're approaching this 4th of July holiday, and we're thinking about democracy in this important year around different elections, we're somber and we're hopeful. And we express what it means to think of the American dream. My name is Naomi Andre, and I am a professor in the departments of Afroamerican and African Studies in the residential college, as well as in women and gender study. I am joined by Louise Chopin, who is professor in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and a professor of voice. And she is also very active, not exclusively as a performer, but also as a researcher and as an administrator. I've always been so impressed with Louise's career, as she has founded the George Shirley Vocal Competition that gets African-American art songs and arias performed and out into the public. She's the director of Videmus, a nonprofit company that focuses on women composers and underrepresented composers, especially with an emphasis on African-American composers. She oversees productions, publications. In fact, the Margaret Bonds anthology of Bonds's Piano Suite has just been published like in the past week, and we are really excited about that. I also have my long-term friend and colleague, Mark Clague, who is a professor at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance in musicology. He also has a bunch of titles as an associate dean at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and he's the director of the American Music Institute. This involves being the editor-in-chief of the George and Ira Gershwin Critical Edition. And so he has published extensively on the national anthems. And I'm using this as a plural because we have the official national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, which dates back to 1814 when Francis Scott Key wrote the poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry, during the War of 1812, and he saw this, that he witnessed the bombing of Fort McHenry by British ships in Baltimore Harbor. And the tune, we'll learn a lot about both the tune, it was a popular British song tune, and we'll learn about different lyrics, alternative lyrics, added lyrics, important lyrics that people adapted for their times. Another thing we're going to be talking about is, when I talk about anthems, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which has been called the Black National Anthem, along with We Shall Overcome, has been an important protest song and used a lot during the Civil Rights Movement. Lift Every Voice and Sing has words by James Weldon Johnson, and then the poem was set to music by his brother J. Rosamond Johnson. I want to emphasize that these different national anthems go back to the 19th century. And what I want to do in this conversation is to talk about these roots and how performances, how the history, how these express different views of a people. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and to get us going into a little more depth, I'm going to pass it to you, Mark, to talk about the role of anthems and different political and historical contexts.
Thanks so much, Naomi. And that was a great introduction, sort of setting the stage. I mean, we're at an incredible moment, I think, in American history with these pandemic and just a whole series of crises that really bring into question, who are we as a nation? What's our responsibility to each other? What who are we as a community? And I think this is where symbols and patriotic symbols are so important, because they give us a sense of being together. There's an important scholar, which both of you know well, Benedict Anderson, who talks about newspapers and the way they sort of bring people together and imagine a community. Well, anthems do the same thing. I mean, if you think about us, sort of sea to shining sea, Washington, D.C. to Hawaii, sort of Alaska, to Houston, Texas. I mean, just this incredible scope of this country. We are a one people brought together by this Constitution as citizens, yet we never meet each other in person, right? So things like the flag and that symbol, which, of course, became, I think, sort of important in the Civil War when we didn't take any stars off. We said we're a union, we're a community, and the song, the Star-Spangled Banner, is a kind of acoustic rendition, if you will, of the flag. But there's a real question about, I think, what does it mean to be together? And for me, I mean, I'm so grateful to Colin Kaepernick, because that was sort of the first time for me that this issue of race was really brought to the forefront of my consciousness, anyway, with the Star-Spangled Banner, by saying, does our country live up to the ideals of its own Declaration of Independence, about equality, right, about justice for all, about the right to life? I mean, George Floyd, I mean, just this issue of just the fundamental rights we have as Americans are not applied equally to all of us, right? So there's a real sense, I think, that Colin Kaepernick raises about the awareness of that moment of ritual. And I think the beauty of it is that it sort of is a moment of reflection, an opportunity for us to think, are we really together? Are we really living up to those ideals? And Kaepernick, I think, makes it really clear to us that we're not. And so this question of anthems, I think, is really pertinent to today, because it really is about who we are as a people and how do we live up to those ideals. So, I think Lift Every Voice is another really fascinating example, because it goes back to a similar issue, right, with Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if Louise can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I'd like to tell you about it. And situated for myself as an African American woman, I grew up in Virginia, an area called Ettrick, Virginia. That's the home of Virginia State University, which is a historically Black college. All around that area is Petersburg, Virginia, which was a stronghold in the Civil War and important for the Battle of the Crater in the Civil War. And so one of the main streets was called Jefferson Davis Highway, after the president of the Confederacy. We grew up with that, and out in around us on other sides, there were names for Native Americans. Ettrick actually was a village given to Pocahontas by her father Powhatan, because it looks over the Appomattox River. So I'm setting that up as this is an area that is representing several cultures. We saw Confederate flags, we saw Confederate symbolism, we saw Native American symbolism, and then in the middle of that, you have a historically Black university. The Lift Every Voice and Sing for an African American growing up on that campus was as important as the national anthem. Every event that we went to, from sporting events to lectures to public concerts, every event began by everyone standing for the national anthem, immediately followed by a singing by everybody of Lift Every Voice and Sing, all three verses from memory. I went to the laboratory school that was on campus, and as school children, we were taught this anthem as small children. And I think that that's important, because this anthem has its roots in children. It's somewhere between 1900 and 1905 in Jacksonville, Florida. This piece was written as a poem and set to music by the brothers Johnson. The older brother, James Weldon Johnson, was an activist in the Harlem Renaissance and a writer, and his brother, Jay Rosamond, was a well-known composer, writing with Bob Cole on musicals. And the thing is that this piece has its life initially with these children in Jacksonville, Florida. And then think about the history of African Americans for a while. It wasn't adopted immediately as the Negro National Anthem, but you have things like 1905 Niagara Movement with W.E. Du Bois. You have race riots in Atlanta in 1906. You've got Bloody Day race riots in Illinois in 1908. You have the founding of the NAACP in 1909. You have Carter G. Woodson Society, ASALH, which my father was national president for, founded in 1915. You've got Marcus Garvey establishing the American branch of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Harlem Renaissance begins. Then you have Bloody Summer of 1919 with the race riots in 25 cities across the United States. At that point, the anthem is adopted by the NAACP as the Negro National Anthem. So it comes from its humble life with children as a poem that talks about liberation and optimism to being adopted as nationwide, an anthem that calls for that from every citizen that's an African American, and it's heard throughout this country.
It's a fascinating connection. What you just made me think about is the role of school children and actually the adoption of the Star-Spangled Banner, which we don't usually think of. I mean, as Naomi pointed out, it becomes the official anthem only in 1931 by an act of Congress, but it's actually used as an anthem in the Civil War and even earlier. But what's interesting to me is that it's really in music education books and primers for school kids in the public schools in like the 1890s, where you really see the anthem sort of become better known. And I think, it's very much a part of turning to a new generation with new ideas, right? So we've come off the Civil War, and basically all of the adults are caught up in that sort of North versus South. But the kids who are now in school in 1890 didn't live at that time. They've grown up in a new world. And so I think it's that energy behind it in the 1890s. And then of course it gets caught up in the Spanish-American War and a kind of jingoism and World War I. And there's ways in which, one of the interesting issues is, is it patriotic to protest? Is Colin Kaepernick being patriotic? Can we use the anthem as an aspect of protest? And I think that protest is part of the history of the anthem. One of the things I talk about a lot is all the different lyrics, and Naomi mentioned this in the introduction, that have been sung to the Star-Spangled Banner. We think of it as just this one sort of sacred song that's immutable and can't be changed, and you have to behave in a certain way and all this. But actually, if you lined up all of those lyrics from end to end, from the earliest to the latest, at this point I found over 200 sets of lyrics that have been written to the tune we know as the Star-Spangled Banner. And Francis Scott Key's lyric is about number 80. So it doesn't start with Key. It actually, Key's sort of in the early history of it. And it's a kind of public conversation in lyrics, a debate, if you will, about the country. And so there are campaign songs for Thomas Jefferson. There are songs about public, foreign policy during the Adams administration. There are a lot of 4th of July songs, which is how it gets attached to American patriotism. There's songs about the Navy, including a song by Francis Scott Key that predates the Star-Spangled Banner. It's from 1805, 9 years before he was in the Chesapeake Bay on board a ship without piano. He's not a composer really, but he knows this tune and he imagines these lyrics, and then they get published in the newspaper and then reprinted. It's sort of like a early social media. It's like an Instagram post from 1814, and it's picked up in one newspaper and then reprinted in paper after paper, and people then read about current events and ideas to the melody of music in their head. And I think what it does is it not only conveys a debate, but it conveys the emotion behind the debate, right? What people feel passionate about. And the Star-Spangled Banner melody, that anacreontic melody, is interesting because it has that high part, right? I mean, there's the rockets red glare and bombs bursting in air is really high. We know it's high because it's hard to sing, but in musical terms, it's also intense, right? When you get high, you sort of reach, there's a kind of intensity, a struggle to reach those high notes. And so in all of these lyrics, there's a moment of passion that's then resolved. And that's sort of what Key is talking about, right? There's this scary moment, the British are bombing Fort McHenry. But one of the coolest lyrics, like I wish every person in America knew 2 lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner. One is, the Francis Scott Key one, but another one is by a Baptist minister from 1844 called "Oh Say Do You Hear?" And this is an anti-slavery lyric that was published actually first, believe it or not, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We have an abolitionist newspaper called the Signal of Liberty. And then that was picked up by William Lloyd Garrison for his The Liberator and published nationally. But it's this incredibly sort of emotional and intense lyric that's pretty graphic. I mean, it describes the suffering of people, you know, captive as slaves, but what it really does is it trades upon the image of freedom and the flag as a symbol of freedom. And how can we be in a nation that espouses the ideal of freedom when 4 million people are held in captivity and servitude? So that emotional irony between what we're saying and what we're doing is heightened in 1844 in the same way that Kaepernick does it in 2016 and says, you know, the police are enforcing white supremacy, and we're not living up to our ideals. And so that tension is actually a long part of the history of the tune that I think is important, you know. So one of the questions now is like, maybe we need new lyrics, or maybe we need more songs, or, you know, when we have the Super Bowl, why do we always sing the Star-Spangled Banner? In fact, in the 1970s, they sang America the Beautiful at the Super Bowl, right? So one of the things that'd be interesting is maybe the next time we have a game in the big house, we sing Lift Every Voice and Sing instead of the Star-Spangled Banner as we raise the flag. Maybe we need that plural anthems that Naomi talked about.
That would be lovely to at least have it at the same experience that I had, where you sing them both. I hope that would be the case. And one of the things about singing, since I've sung both of them, as Mark articulated, the beginning of of the Star-Spangled Banner goes down. Oh, say, can you say so? It's pretty low. And then you get to the heightened part, it goes up. If you put it in the high note, you're actually singing a 2-octave range, which is really hard for anybody to find the right key. It's usually published in B flat. And so they're going, I'm sorry, F. So they're going down and then they go all the way up. No, it's in B flat, right? It's B flat.
It's in B flat.
Thank you. I was trying to remember the key it was in. Lift Every Voice and Sing does the exact opposite, that you have the exuberant part at the beginning when you have Lift Every Voice and Sing to get people roused up. And then as you talk about the difficulties in life, sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us, it goes into a lower part. So the range is not as bad with Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's an octave and I think it's about a third. So it's a little bit smaller and more manageable range for the average crowd, but it has sort of an ABA structure in terms of that middle section is the lower part. And then once it starts talking about the defiance of facing the rising sun, let us march on till victory is won, the tune heads back up. And it does that for all 3 of the verses. And it's traditional to have the 3 verses and to sing the last verse slower than the other ones, because it starts off talking about God of our weary years, God of our silent tears. So it's the most somber of the thoughts. It becomes more and more somber from Lift Every Voice and Sing that gets you going to Stony the Road We Trod, which talks about we've been down this road so many times. And then the third one, God of our weary, we're tired, and our silent tears. And then you talk about lest our feet stray from the places, which is that low part again. And it starts to build the momentum until you get to the end, true to our God, true to our native land. Listening to people sing this piece is just so exhilarating. There's a wonderful YouTube that has been done recently. Nicole Heston, I think Heston is her name. It put together all these singers, including several who are from University of Michigan. I saw one of my former students in the video, and several opera friends. But it's just brilliant to look at that piece being done. Roland Carter wrote the version of it that college choirs for all the HBCUs, everybody knows it from memory, and that's the version that I would say is probably today the best known and loved by the masses. But I'm with you. I hope that we do the national anthem into Lift Every Voice and Sing, that will be our call, at least, you know, in the near future.
I love to hear how these different versions sort of permeate both history as well as our individual experiences. I grew up in New York, and sadly we didn't sing Lift Every Voice and Sing regularly. In fact, it was something that was primarily in all Black gatherings. Here in Ann Arbor, I belong to the Willis Patterson Our Own Thing Chorale, and we also sing Lift Every Voice and Sing, and it has been part of our repertory. And I know, Louise, at a conference that you organized on Black music research last September, when we all could be together, that we all sang it, all three verses, though you were among the handful of people who knew all three verses.
Me
And
and
you
the
just,
older members of the of the group who had learned it. But you know, that was almost spontaneous. That was not a planned thing, but it was that feeling that we're here together, and so many African Americans were in the room. There was a desire to do it.
yes. And there also was a feeling of sort of a Sunday morning, let's, before we say goodbye, sort of it brought together this coming together, this community, a church-like feel. And so absolutely, you just sat down on the piano and we did it. Mark, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, no, that was a powerful moment. I think it was important that, you stand when you sing Lift Every Voice and Sing in the same way that you stand usually when you sing the Star-Spangled Banner traditionally. And, what's fascinating to me is how many African American performers are celebrated for their renditions of the national anthem. I mean, if people will often say, well, what's the greatest version? For me, it's Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock. But typically when people say what's the greatest performance ever of the Star-Spangled Banner, they talk about Whitney Houston in 1990 at the Super Bowl, so, and it's an impassioned, powerful performance. And she actually, interestingly, changes the music a little bit. She does it in 4/4 time instead of 3/4 time. And for me, it's more hymn-like. There's a kind of reverent quality to it. And of course, for her, it gives her a whole extra beat just to open up on the vowels, right? So that's really powerful. But, that tradition of sort of different versions or musical arrangements. I mean, in the 19th century, in Key's century, it's all about this lyrical debate and writing different words. In the 20th century, it's about how do you do it? How do you perform it? Like, who claims their identity as an American? What can you say about being an American by how you sing it? And so, with like Jose Feliciano at the 1968 World Series, and the day before his performance, Marvin Gaye sang it. And he sang it for the 1983 NBA All-Star Game, was pretty famous. Aretha Franklin sang it for the 1968 Democratic Convention. And then Hendrix at Woodstock, for me, is in some ways is the ultimate. And there's a couple interesting things about this. And I wrote like a 70-page article on this because I was so fascinated about it. But people tend to think he just did it that one time as a kind of spontaneous like expression of his patriotism. That was actually a part of a 2-year obsession. And he, goes to England and sort of forms his trio, The Experience, and then comes back to the United States. He can't be accepted as a rock musician in the United States, right? He was playing R&B in the United States, and he goes to England and they see him as this amazing guitarist and this sort of psychedelic rocker. And he gets, two white guys to join his band, Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding. And then he comes back to the United States. And what's interesting is he's playing the anthem when he arrives at Monterey Pop. He plays different songs like Wild Thing, and he plays Purple Haze, and he calls them American anthems. And I think he's wrestling with his own identity. What does it mean to be a black man in America in 1969? And he's playing this tune over and over again. And he plays it first in Maryland, actually, Columbia, Maryland in 1968. And then Woodstock is a year later. And he's working in taps. He's working in these illustrations of sort of, the words, rockets, red glare, and bombs bursting in air. When he does all the crazy improvisational sort of firefight and bombs peeling, on one hand, it's illustrating history and telling the story of history, just like the song does, just like Lift Every Voice does. I realized when Louise told the story, they both are songs of history. They tell a story. So Hendrix is illustrating that story by showing the bombs, but he's also doing it in a way that references Vietnam, that's referencing, sort of, rioting and civil rights struggles in the United States, Martin Luther King's death. So there's sirens of tritone sounds. There are these sort of pealing feedback falls like bombs. And he's making people realize that this song is about today as it was about yesterday, right? He's inventing history, and he's urging, I think, his fans, who are all young people at this time, to sort of invent another country, right? To be a new nation, to do something else, to bring this vision of Woodstock of peace and harmony and racial cooperation, sort of to make that real. And we're still struggling to do that today. But the way in which I think African Americans have claimed and made this song part of their life, that aspiration to be equal, the aspiration to participate in American life in a full way, to get respect, to be treated fairly, to be leaders, to be citizens, is what they're sort of crying for in these performances, which are so emotionally powerful in our history.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, I think that piggybacking on what you said, the way that each person brings their own style, their musical style. If they're a gospel musician, they might stretch the phrases or do some things. That's the way that that person feels the national anthem. It is very personal and powerful to every citizen. And so anyone that sings it adds their own culture in that performance and their own heart. It's very much part of the community, every community. And you'll see the same with Lift Every Voice and Sing. That's why you'll hear it stretched out in some and moved a little faster in other places, because it's all, how do you feel at that given moment? I think I've been hearing Lift Every Voice and Sing a little slower these days because of where we are. And people really want to hear these words and focus on something from 1900s, another century, how it's still applicable to today and how it's heartfelt to those African Americans that sing it today.
I think all of these issues around the national anthem as a sonic marker of, Mark, I really love this idea of the visual image of the flag. Today we're seeing flags having a lot of meaning, whether it's the flag that we see with the stars and the stripes, or whether it's the flag of the Confederacy, and how that seems to speak to certain people in a way that brings something they feel they can't fully get from the stars and stripes, and how these flags become such important meanings for us. It makes me think of Nicole Hannah-Jones with her 1619 project, where she has her opening essay to the project, which her essay just won the Pulitzer. America wasn't a democracy until Black Americans made it one. And it feels that she has encapsulated so many of the themes that we're talking about, as we have Black voices, white voices, many voices, singing experiences that are rooted to something in the past and have an incredible sort of sense of changing and evolving meaning today. Just for those of you to remind you of her really incredible essay, she talks about both the history, sort of a narrative introducing the 1619 project from a Black vantage point, and she really masterfully talks about her own experience as a Black woman and her sort of puzzlement when her father was so interested in hanging the American flag and having that be a symbol and having it always be pristine. And she thought, America has been a really rough place for Black folks. Why are you hanging the flag? And then as she learns more about America's history and sort of hears more, gets older, learns about her father's experience as a veteran and what he went through growing up in Jim Crow and segregation, she realizes that this is a story that is so relevant to Black people. And she's able to see the flag, as she says, the United States is founded on both an ideal and a lie, this sort of coming to grips with the people who framed and brought together the great American experiment about freedom and equality were slave owners, and how yet through all of this, through emancipation, through the civil rights movement, it's Americans who've held on to this dream of freedom and equality. We hear this with when Frederick Douglass is talking in 1852 about how what is to the slave the 4th of July. And he's saying this all after the fugitive slave law, which basically makes the entire United States a place where Black people can be captured and made into slaves. And yet he's talking about this freedom and equality. And we see it again when Martin Luther King is giving a sermon on July 4th, 1965 at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And he's talking about the American dream, how now more than ever, America is challenged to realize its dream. For the shape of the world today does not permit our nation the luxury of an anemic democracy, and the price that America must pay for the continued oppression of the Negro and other minority groups is the price of its own destruction. For the hour is late, and the clock of destiny is ticking out. We must act now before it is too late. This idea of democracy and freedom and equity is something that both white Americans feel entitled to, and Black Americans keep earning it and trying to earn it. And we're at a point now, as we think of democracy and debate, what are these different voices? Who are we as a country?